Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. In the previous part, we took a look at the elements of Stoicism and a man named Seneca. That will become a little bit more important in this part as we look at the structure of Roman society, the different groups which were vying for power and dominance over one another, the people who came to see themselves in large political clashes, and Nero and his golden house. So first, let's take a look at the divisions of Roman society and some interesting facts and ideas of how their culture worked and how their society managed to function. So we're going to quickly look over the Republican period, which we think of a republic as representing the people, and near the end of the republic, the plebes, the lower caste, the commoners, did have some political power and say, but for the most part, the aristocracy was actually the main driving force behind the republic. So the Senate had previously existed. It was ran by aristocratic houses. The aristocrats in the Roman times were known as patricians. They had illustrious lines of relatives and deceased figures from history who had led expensive and luxurious lives, thus bestowing on their descendants the same line of ennobled life. So, the patricians and the plebeians were the two main castes, and for the majority of the history of the Roman Republic, the patricians ruled with an iron fist. They had the Senate, they had the generals, they had the leaders of the Roman society, and they had unwritten codes and rules, which served to just about always favor themselves over the smaller people. Now, Seneca himself and many other Stoic philosophers had this idea that one should be separate from crowds while also maintaining a sameness with the average person in the Roman Empire. The reason for this was because the Romans understood very well that something changed when people got into groups. This was the foundation of what today we know as group psychology, mass appeal, and concepts like this. The aristocrats were always very into the attempt to control and manipulate those below them by organizing them into mobs, into groups, and by sometimes using this mob against one another through various techniques in propaganda, in information control, disinformation, a lot of concepts which actually have a lot to do with the past 200 years of our own society. So while the plebes in the early republic did not have a lot of recourse politically, they did have something very important which they could use to check the aristocrats, and that was manpower. The individual aristocrat may have wielded much more influence and much more political affiliation than the average plebe, but if odds like 100 or 1,000 to 1, in a street brawl, the plebes could often find themselves the victors. Swords and other weapons were banned from the city of Rome, but in various times there would be lots of large uprisings that would actually be fueled by the iniquities of the plebes and their feelings of disaffectedness from the state. One of the most important would be the social wars. We talked a bit about the social wars last time when we talked about Sulla, and the concept was essentially that Rome had grown to such a point that the rural poor, the people living outside of the city of Rome that weren't themselves wealthy, and even many who were themselves wealthy, were less than even the plebes living in the city of Rome. Because they had such massive manpower, they organized into large groups and they tried to wrestle different rights from the aristocrats and from the Senate. So this is where we're going to see the interplay of the natural strategy, which is sort of the foundation for this series. Quick refresher, we have the use of violence, the use of deception, and the use of coalitions. Now, interestingly, coalitions could be formed between individuals in the aristocratic classes, but the plebes, who made up 90% or more of the Roman society, would actually have to form coalitions entirely with themselves, because once divided, it would be very easy for individuals in the upper echelons to control them and to determine their fate. In the social wars, we saw various coalitions between people who would come to hate each other, such as Sulla and Marius, against the coalitions of the lower classes to vie for the rights of the average person, not just in the city of Rome, but overall in the Italian peninsula. So, what were these factions and how did they break down essentially? There was two main political groups, or organizations, however you want to look at it. These were the Optimates and the Populares. So the Optimates came from the ideologies of the original aristocrats who had overthrown the Roman king and instituted the Senate as the ruling body of the Roman civilization. They believed in conservation of the old ways, they believed in enriching the aristocrats, and to a certain degree, they believed that rather than giving rights and privileges to the plebes, that there should be a sort of scale or ladder that allowed plebeian families, not individuals, but lineages, to slowly ascend to the ranks of the aristocrats or the patricians, as a sort of reward for those who had done well and had followed in their steps. So it was a sort of conservatism, but it was also very into the idea of moving up and allowing certain individuals and their descendants, not them specifically, to eventually become as powerful as the other Optimates if they followed the right conditions. They were much less likely to form coalitions with the mob or the plebes in the streets. They were much more likely to form coalitions with each other to produce legislature, to line their own pockets, and to get other things done such as that. So then we have the Populares, who were also generally aristocrats, patrician-born, but they wanted to bring rights, privileges, and different things like this to the average plebe in the street. Now, there was always very fierce debate on whether they genuinely wanted to help these people or whether they were pandering to them for a sort of power, because if you had an idea, which we'll get into a couple in just a minute, that would give lots of people lots of things, they're probably going to vote for you. They're probably going to vote for the people who are on your side, and you will displace the other aristocrats, the Optimates, who are working solely with each other and with the idea that the average plebe should not be given these rights. So, the Optimates and the Populares feuded, and it was actually the Populares who eventually put a wedge between the aristocrats and the plebeians in the streets, and brought themselves to a position of autocracy. Julius Caesar himself was a Populare. One of his main concepts was the redistribution of land from the aristocrats, generally by force, which meant killing them, taking their land, and giving it to the average people, which was a redistribution of wealth. This was very popular with the commoners, but it wasn't very popular with a lot of the aristocrats, with the patricians. They thought that a man who hadn't earned these things would not be able to use them. They were thinking along the lines of Stoicism. Fortune can be an extremely corruptible force and should not be used to make one better, since better and worse to them didn't really exist. Unfortunately, to the hungry masses in the streets, better and worse were very real things, and the coalition between the several few populares actually helped to form the upcoming imperial structure, which was the emperor Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and then the last two we'll talk about in just a moment. They were the first Julio-Claudian dynasty. They were much more allied with the average person in the street than with the aristocrat. This would cause huge fractures because, as I said, the aristocrats originally killed the king of the Roman Republic and gave themselves that power. We would soon see another playing out of this, except this time the plebe in the street would have a bit more of a say on exactly how it would go and who would rule. So, on to the main topic of this series, which I'm very excited to talk about. If I do this right, I should actually change some of your conceptions about history and historical figures. So now we're going to talk about Nero and his golden house, or Domus Aurea. The Latin word Aurea meant gold. Aurea, which is actually why on the periodic table you'll see AU representing gold. It's because it comes from the Latin word. Just a fun fact. So, let's set the stage a bit. We, in the previous section, talked about the populares and their principles of forming coalitions with the plebe mob in order to wield influence of the massive amount of manpower against the other aristocrats, the Optimates. This was the foundation of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first dynasty of emperors in the Roman imperial period. So, just real quick, I'm going to put them in order for you. First, you had Julius Caesar, who seized control through his war in the First Triumvirate to become what he called princeps, or first citizen. He was really an emperor. Then the succession went to Augustus Caesar, who was not his son. And Augustus Caesar passed his down to Tiberius, who again was not his son. Tiberius was followed by Caligula, who had a very short reign because he was probably a relatively brutal guy. He was definitely crazy, and after Caligula's short reign, he had no direct descendant. And the Praetorian Guard, who, let's just talk about them real quick. As I mentioned previously, nobody was allowed to have arms within the city of Rome. So if you did have weapons in the city of Rome, you had a lot of power and influence. The Praetorian Guard were the guards of the emperor and were the only ones allowed to wield violence and to have weapons and arms within the city. This gave them an incredible amount of influence, as it's very hard to come up against someone who could very easily kill you with a legitimate weapon of war. They were also generally some of the best soldiers, very intelligent, passionate, and good at their craft. So they became, in addition to the Optimates in the Senate, the Populares in the imperial role, and the mob in the street, they became a sort of fourth member that one could form coalitions with in order to gain influence in the city. So the Praetorians needed another emperor when they had killed Caligula, or he killed himself. It's one of those things that's a bit hard to decipher because there was a lot of propaganda around this period, but they searched around the palace, and cowering behind a curtain was who would become the future Emperor Claudius. They thought that because he was afraid of the succession, that it would be easy to control him. But this turned out to not be true, and Claudius turned out to be relatively good compared to the majority of his predecessors, emperor. He was kind and just, he did a lot for the average people, and he helped to advance the systems of architecture, which the city and people of Rome were so well known for. But now Claudius had died, and his last wife, Agrippina the Younger, managed to get her son onto the imperial throne. This would be Nero, the emperor who lives in infamy. But should he really? I'm going to put forward that because Nero was a popularity to boot, he did not manage to forge coalitions with other powerful people in the aristocracy. He tried to forge them with the individual in the mob. He was not very good at deception. He was no military leader. What he was an artist. And he actually had a very artful way of dealing with his rule, which we're going to take a look at in just a second. So around this time, Rome had swelled. This was about 50-60 AD. Nero actually came to power when he was very young, about 17 years old. His mother wanted to rule herself and use him sort of as a puppet, which would backfire when he put her to death later. But, you don't mess with the emperor that way, I suppose you could say. So, the aristocrats who were in charge of the military, who were out in the field during this whole time in the wars against the Germans, against the British, against Syria, Palestine, Judea, against the Parthians, they had flowed a lot of wealth back to Rome, because this was sort of the way that it was done. You would go out, you would make war, and you would take the spoils and bring them back to your city. The concept of the lottery comes from ancient Rome. The generals and commanders would divide up the booty and section it off. Every man would put a spear on a wagon wheel. It would be spun. Whoever it landed on got to take that bit. If you were an active soldier in a campaign, you had the right to go about and seize some of the booty during a conquest. This was one of the major ways that Rome funneled wealth back to itself. But Nero was very into the concept of bringing this wealth not to the individual aristocrats to funnel into their lavish villas, into their stables of slaves, but to bring it back to the chest of Rome and to use it for the individual people, which the aristocrats saw generally as theft. So around 64 AD, right in the middle of Nero's reign, a great fire broke out. And several years after Nero's death, many records would say that he was playing a fiddle while the city burned around him, which is funny because it's anachronistic. The fiddle or violin was from the Byzantine period. It was not a Roman invention, and contemporary sources to the Great Fire said that he was actually not even in the city at all. He was outside, I believe in Ostia, which was a port of Rome, and he immediately rushed back. Now, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD burned a large area in the center of Rome. And even though a few aristocratic households were probably consumed, those were the people who were the best off. They were the most capable of dealing with this fire. They probably already had several villas outside which they could easily retreat to. It was the average plebe in the streets of Rome who was most damaged. These people were very poor. They lived in houses which were repaired with individual planks. They breathed foul air because the industry, the ceramics, the metalworking, the slaughtering, all of these things would cloud the air, and they didn't have good air to breathe. They didn't have a whole lot of clean water to drink. They were very apart from nature, and many of them would never get the chance to travel outside the walls of Rome unless they were soldiers, and to see the real beauty which the aristocrats, the patricians themselves, would often retreat to in their summer villas. So Nero had an idea. He had all this wealth from the conquests of the various areas, and the concept that the wealth needed to be funneled back to Rome. So he attempted to further build on his coalition with the mob and build the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was a huge construction project. It had an artificial lake, it had orchards, it had fields, it had huge buildings which were very ornate, and one of them was actually previously just about all Roman construction had been rectangles, the palaces, the temples of Mars, of Jupiter, all of these. Nero was the first to get his architects to build in a circle. They sort of failed. They had to do an octagon that was surrounded by a circle, but because of the new concrete developments from his predecessor, they were able to totally put away the old style of architecture and to bring something new that had a lot of inner space. And another thing that the aristocrats had that the plebes did not was art. They had access to sculptors, to sculptures and paintings from foreign places. Nero brought these and he crammed them into the buildings in the Golden House, and all of the plebes were allowed to come in. Those who worked on it, the artisans, craftsmen, builders, actually had tents, which they turned into tenements and houses that lined the outsides of certain parts of the Golden House. So the average person, after this fire, could now see the beauties that surrounded the city itself. This was very similar to in, let's say, New York City in the late 19th century, when the sky was filled with smog. The average person didn't get to go outside of the city. They didn't get to see the beauty of nature. What did the populists do? They knocked out certain parts. They put in parks such as Central Park, and they tried to beautify the city to make it better for the average person. This is not the first time that this has happened in New York or in Rome. It also happened in the palaces of the kingdoms of various European nobles in the 18th, 17th centuries. It happened previously, way back in the history in ancient Babylon with the Hanging Gardens. But this was a massive move to bring relief from the suffering and pain and grief of the Great Fire to the people of Rome, who, after all, were the ones marching in the armies to go and take that wealth to begin with. Alright, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This was the second of the 3 parts on our political and social strategy in Rome. As I said previously, I'm trying to keep this separate from a military strategy, so it might look a little bit different from some of the other ones that we're going to be doing, but having a good time doing it. Hope that you've enjoyed it. If you do like it, make sure to leave a like. If there's anything else that you'd like to know, you'd like to see, leave a comment below. If you want to see more like this, you want to catch the next part as well, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And there's going to be one more part on this, and then we're going to move and we're going to continue the previous episode about Greece in the Byzantine period. This was sort of just a break, and it was to look at the fact that even though lots of Roman life was about war, it wasn't every facet, and a lot of the wars that they fought were personal, political, and through intrigue. So thank you very much for watching. Until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.